we're going to do now, again, today is all about doing my best to show you, and I understand it's not the most fun, but not everything has to be fun. But I wanted to show you today how to first begin synthesis, which I feel like we did on the board, right? But then the really tricky bit, how to move from the board, or in your case, notes, to an actual paper. And that's what we're going to attempt with the first part of this class. Now, what I was doing as you guys were making those connections, and they were, a lot of them were really good connections actually, I was doing my best to kind of sum up. There it is. Yeah. All right. I was doing my best to kind of sum up those ideas, right? The first one we came to was, we have a stereotypical cowboy who's his best self in crisis, right? I tried to define that for us just a little bit. And he knows it, and that's the self-awareness. That's all three texts together. Now, one important thing I want you to remember as you write this paper, I have to be very careful even how I say this. I am not saying you do not perform analysis, because you do. You have to analyze everything these sources tell you. You have to analyze the film. That's the only way to get them talking to each other, right? You do have to perform analysis in pretty much the same way we've talked about all semester. You got to dig into details, you got to pay attention to language, things like this. That's not changing, okay? But most, if not all, in some ways, arguments that you present for this paper are not yours, right? You're presenting, if you're this student, Brehan, Ezekiel, Donahoe, and you're talking about Die Hard in the midst of all that. So again, you have maybe with Die Hard you make some arguments, but for the most part, you are putting arguments into conversation with each other. At no point did we say as a class, oh, he's his best self in crisis, which is just like a cowboy, and he's aware of that, right? Like we never really came to that. Those came from those articles. Because of that, we have to make sure we give credit to those people who have had those ideas. Now, the way you guys are used to doing that, and you still need to do it here, is citations, okay? You still need parentheticals, again, all the MLA stuff, that doesn't change. But I bring all that up to say, we're going to try to build an introduction today. We're not really going to quote a lot, if at all, in the introduction. There's not really a place for it. We're going to paraphrase. But even when you paraphrase, if it's not your idea, if you got it somewhere else, it's very important to indicate that. Okay? We're going to try to do that now. The last thing I'm going to say, I'd just like to remind folks, because we are rough drafting on the fly, it might be a little ugly at times, right? Anyway, I'm hoping you guys can kind of see the board. Oh shit, wrong thing, hold on. I know some of you have young eyes, so you can probably still read the board over here, but I want you to be able to see that as well. All right. So we're going to start with the roadmap. That's what these are, by the way. When I told you I'm kind of summing up how these body paragraphs are going to be built, that's what your roadmap should be, right? So let's start with this. Who claims, for instance, it'll be like the lamest game show you've ever played. Who claims McLean is this stereotypical cowboy figure? Who gives us that idea? Good. We'll start there. We need to define that a little bit. How's he a John Wayne figure in the film? And we haven't looked at Donahoe, but we looked at the bib. So what is she kind of talking about? How is he a cowboy figure? In what ways? How's he like John Wayne? If you don't remember the bib, that's fine. Just think about the movie. What kind of guy is he? Especially, again, once the bullets start flying, because that's what we're going to get to with the best self. How's he like a cowboy?
Loner.
In terms of his relative, I'm gonna say relative independence, because again, he does have Al, but Al is just a voice, so he's helpful, but only so much. His relative independence, and we can say toughness. There gotta be a better word.
Ruggedness.
That's a little better. There's something we're missing, and again, we don't have time. But I'm the kind of guy, I quibble with like words. That's kind of my thing. So I would be stuck here for about 2 minutes in front of you trying to figure out a better word. Anyway, okay. As pointed out by this person, this idea, right? That is their idea. We did not come up with it, so we make sure to point that out. But of course, this is synthesis. What are we doing with that cowboy idea? Where did we go with that on the board over here? Something about best self. Obviously, that's Brehan. How do we connect this concept of the best self to this concept of the cowboy? What's Brehan's idea of the best self got to do with this cowboy stuff?
Brehan talks about whenever the action starts, that's when his better side comes out.
Okay. So he's kind of saying, correct me if I'm wrong, right? We're all spitballing, but he's kind of saying his best self is that cowboy self. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's what it's called.
Okay. Oh my God. There, sorry. Because he's uncomfortable in situations Is that fair? I think that's kind of it, right? He's no good at the party. He's no good on the plane. He's no good in the limo. Like, we see what his skills are through all the cool parts of the movie. But all the other moments, he's like, I don't know, can I shoot somebody? Like, he's not able to do it, right? Okay. Now, how do we get to self-awareness with Ezekiel? What? How do we talk about self-awareness with McClane's best self, with his cowboy stuff? Ezekiel kind of says he's aware of some things about himself. What's he aware of?
That he's good with a gun.
And that's kind of it. I mean, I'm limiting him some, right? But like,
He's good at surviving.
yeah, he's really good at several things. But like, the more normal stuff, the more. Maybe when your wife is telling you she misses you, don't come at her with the my last name business, right? I got peanut butter on my mouth. Yeah, like that whole thing. Okay. Importantly, McClane knows this about himself. I've used it already, that's fine. It's pointed out by Ezekiel. All right, now that's not the most artfully done synthesis I've ever seen, but that's synthesis. We moved from Donahoe's idea to Brehan's to Ezekiel's. We did it just like that, right? Awesome. Let's do it again. This one. Not only is McClane an everyman, more specifically, he's a standard dad, both physically and I kind of gave you guys like in terms of his motivation, in terms of like what drives him, you know? Because again, if you think about other action movies, especially, sometimes those guys have families, but like it's more window dressing. It seems like a lot of the time. It's not like, I don't know. They're just different. He seems like a different kind of guy, right? Who talks about him as an everyman up here? Good. Where do we go from there? He's not just a typical guy. We doubled down and said, what? He's a... Well, he's not just an everyman, but he's a what? He's a dad. Yeah. He's a typical, it could be argued McClane knows he's a typical guy, a typical father. But then we got to get this question of physicality and motivation. As both Freehand and Hezekiah point out his everyman, what? What are his everyman qualities? How do they describe them? What do they talk about?
Physical appearance.
His everyman stature. I think she used that term at some point. Yeah. And ideals. We'll just run with that. Maybe we would change that later. All right. Now what we've done here, we did the same kind of thing we did in those sentences. We did it way quicker. McClane's a typical guy, a typical father. Those are the ideas we're dealing with, right? As both of these authors point out, and then we talk about how they point it out, right? It's a different way to do sentences. All I want you to see here is sometimes, depending on what you have to say, it could be a little chewier, right? That's kind of how we would talk about that. A lot of sentences, a lot of names. Other times, it could be quicker. Both work, right? All right, we got one more thing to do. Talking about, I turned to his code of ethics because, I mean, in Donahoe, she calls it his code of honor. Either one is fine with me. Like, his code of honor, I kind of forced you guys, at least, to agree with me that it's somehow antiquated, less realistic than the villain. We moved from Donahoe to Brehan, and kind of maybe to the movie itself, to the Rockets scene, right? What? How's he not completely realistic, maybe? Completely just normal guy on the street is basically what we're saying. What are we focused on? It's not how he looks, it's not his motivations, right? We said this one aspect of him kind of sets him apart from most people. It's what makes him a hero, by the way. You could argue is what makes him the main character. It's his code. What's his code of honor? How did we define it? To refresh your memory, I know it was before break. It's the rocket scene. Gruber hits the guys once, right? And as I believe you pointed out, it's the second, like he realizes Gruber's going to launch a second one, right? Because Gruber says something over the radio. And he tells him, like, I forget what he says exactly, but like, you took him out already, like, you hit him already, they're done. Like, that's what upsets him, right? The lack of fairness, the lack of, they can no longer compete, they're no longer a threat, right? And you used, I think, the analogy of handcuffs. Same kind of deal, right? Once they've been beaten, not destroyed, but beaten, according to McLean, it should be over. Yeah? And Gruber violates that code. Why is that? There's two ways to take that, but like, either why does that make McLean the hero? Or why could you argue that makes him less realistic here? That code of ethics. Oh, you guys. I mean, we can take a dark turn.
I think I'm turned around because I'm looking at it opposite the way you look at it.
Sure.
That is his code by being fair, not overkill and everything, but I think the way you're explaining it's more like the villain is being the realistic one.
Well, because all I'm saying is, like, again, if it were the kind of world it should be, the world we would like to live in, people would be more like McLean in this moment, right? They'd be more forgiving, they'd be more fair, yeah? But I don't know that that's the case. And again, I'm misanthropic, so, you know, I'm a little biased. But I think a lot of the time, a lot of the problems in the world, right, the real world, kind of come down to people don't really want to help each other, people aren't really concerned with fairness, people are a little more selfish than we like to admit. And that is exactly the reason why McLean is less realistic here, but also why he's the hero. Because we look to heroes for things we aspire to. Like, we want the world to be like that. And another way to think of it, the way I would make that argument to you is, if the world were more like that, it wouldn't be such a big moment for McLean to call out the villain. Do you know what I mean? Like, it wouldn't resonate like it does. But I think we see something in that scene where we go, a bunch of motherfuckers walking around just like that one, right? They would do that sort of thing. And that's all I'm saying. Again, I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it should be that way. But I'm saying I think that's what the movie is kind of tapping into there. Does that make sense?
I don't know if I really agree with it, but
Well, you may be more optimistic than me. I mean, that, and look, I'm a little biased.
Makes sense.
I'm a little bit
I
biased.
feel like whenever I saw that scene, like I could understand it because I would like to think that I would have mercy.
For sure. Well, and you may be one of the good ones. But I don't know, like, percentage-wise, like,
Right.
because I worked retail for a bunch of years, man. There's some monsters out there. Anyway,
I agree.
all right, but look, like, just to bring it back, if you're gonna placate me at the very least, say he's not entirely realistic, however, as what we're talking about, his code of ethics. I gave you the word antiquated. I knew Google would help me with that one. What is Gruber, by the way? And this is a bit of a sidebar, but this may also be a little bit what I'm thinking about. I'm really into history. Like, I don't know if you guys do podcasts at all, but like, there's some really good history podcasts out there. Just to nerd out for a second, they're really good. One I really like is one called Hardcore History, and he goes all the way, like, he'll talk about Byzantines, and he'll talk, but some of the more recent stuff is in World War II. World War II and I are widely considered the first total wars, which is, before then, we didn't attack civilians, we didn't do, but when those happened, it was like, nope, fuck it, everybody dies. And they're much more merciless, they're much more machine-like. And you could argue, and we're not doing that here, but I just wanted to help you understand some of the context. You could argue the antiquated bit comes from McLean being more like that cowboy, more like John Wayne, single guy out doing stuff with his hands, even if it's killing bad guys, it's with his hands, you know what I mean? Gruber is modern warfare. It's a fucking rocket. It's from a distance. You don't even really see the guys in the truck. Do you know what I mean? Like, they're faceless. It's much less human, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make. And again, in a way, Gruber in that moment makes more sense as the bad guy in all the other action movies too, right? They would do that sort of thing. It's that post-human that Brehan talks about. But again, the misanthrope in me says that's kind of where the world is at. But I don't, you know. Anyway, just to better understand maybe where my head is at, his code of ethics seems antiquated when compared to Gruber's. I'm going to say, like, what's the word for what Gruber does? Like, he says, hit them again, right? He does say that. He says, hit it again or hit them again. I wanted to say ferocity, but that's not the right word. Like, for a guy to say that, how would we describe that? Do you think? He says, hit them again on the radio.
So, expected outcome for a villain.
Sure, for sure. But I mean, again, you could also argue that stuff like that's what makes him the villain. Do you know what I mean? Like if we're just treating him as a character, the same way we are McClane, you don't show up as the hero or the villain. You what you do makes you that, right? So like, what kind of person says hit them again? Maybe like inhumanity almost or something. Like, you know, like that's not right either. But we rolled it, I suppose. So I'm mostly just talking to you, right? He's not entirely realistic, however, his code of ethics seems antiquated when compared to Gruber's inhumanity. That's only because that's in my head. That's not what we're talking about, so we're going to fix it. But to fix it, what we don't have in this example yet, and I did this on purpose up until the last part, which is just me screwing up. We got to get our authors in here. Code of Honor was from Donahoe. Realism, he's talking about setting and stakes, right? Brehan. Importantly, when he brings up realism, he doesn't. Like, he talks about every man separately, but he does not bring up McClane here, which is potentially interesting. And then we got to the Rockets. So how do we fit Donahoe into Code of Honor? How do we attribute that idea to her?
As Donahoe speaks of, maybe comments, code of ethics.
He's a cowboy.
As Donahoe speaks of, seems antiquated.
Alright. That's true. That works. Okay. We're going to get to realism with Brehan. He says the movie, in terms of realism, the setting, the stakes, are all things that, you know, granted, we probably haven't lived through ourselves, but you see stuff like that on the news. You know what I mean? Like, it's stuff that has touched our lives, if even in a small way, for the most part, right? So it's believable. Can we get to him here anyway? Is any of this believable? I'm actually going to go ahead and just delete that last one. That's not good. Oh, thanks, man. Okay. Oh, God.
This is trash. Thank you.
How do we talk about Brehan with any of this? Specifically, it might help you. Brehan talks about Gruber. How he dresses, he says, is realistic. How concerned with it he is, he says, is realistic. How proud of himself he is over his planning and all this, he says, is pretty realistic. He feels like a real person as opposed to like a cartoon villain that you'd see in some of these movies, you know?
Kind of like a business guy himself. They're in
Good. And I think that's where where I come to the modern warfare deal. Like, the movie very purposefully parallels Gruber to the business types, like Takagi before he kills him, Ellis, just the general feel of the office, like a corporation. What does a corporation do? What's its motivation? Make money. That's Gruber. That's Gruber's motivation. That's what he's here for. Like, well, he's doing it illegally. It's like, are corporations always like super on the up and up? No. Are they bloodless? Are they merciless? Are they, maybe you could argue, inhumane? For sure. For sure. I think that's our end, right? Highlights his code of ethics. Gruber's, and we'll define that even further, corporate inhumanity. There. Now look, this is, I'm not going to lie to you, hella tight. What I mean by that is, I use 90s slang for you because it's just some older. Most of what you guys do when it comes to synthesis in the intro is going to look more like this, okay? It's not going to be one sentence. It'll take you a little bit of room. You have to explain the ideas as you go. In explaining how an idea works, that's actually what allows you to connect another idea to it, right? Just summing up a thing, like in a phrase, limits your possibilities, usually. So they're going to look more like this. Oh, actually, I cut one out. Look, it's even longer. Sometimes, though, I did two of them shorter, mostly for time, to be totally honest with you. Sometimes you can do it in a sentence, right? But you see in those sentences, like especially the last one, look at how wild this sentence is. When I talk about sentence structure, and we don't have time in summer class, good God, what time do we have for anything? If you think about a comma or a semicolon, writing a good sentence is like a straight road, okay? It's easy to drive down. It's easy to understand. This is a sentence. He is not entirely realistic. Got it. That's a sentence. But every time you add a semicolon or a comma, it's a turn in that road. And the curvier a road gets, the harder it can be to follow. And I'm sorry for this pained metaphor, but it does work, okay? That makes sense. But we turn again real fast. We turn again. Like, every time you turn, you ask your reader to hang on to all the shifts. And I only make that point to you to say, you can't do this too often. Just as a writer, you gotta be careful doing this too much. But in a paper like this, it can help you. Sometimes you just need a sentence. And sometimes it gets pretty crazy. Does that make sense? Enough? Anyway, what do we have here? We have our roadmap. Could it be longer? Yes. Do we have time to do that? No. What we have to do now, because this is a big chunk of our introduction. Do you guys remember the other parts of an introduction? You need a hook? If you want one, you don't have to. It's optional. But you can have one. If we have a little moment here at the end, we may try to slap one on there. What do you need aside from the hook and the roadmap? There's two other parts.
introduce the text.
You got to introduce the text. We'll talk about that in a second. And a thesis. Both of those, very important, are a little bit different for this paper. Okay? Introduction of the text. Typically, you would consider Die Hard your text. And it is in some ways, but actually, your text is this nebulous thing I keep talking about, which is the conversation between all your texts. That's what you're studying. Die Hard has a lot to do with that for pretty obvious reasons, but it isn't technically your text. Okay? So to help that make sense, I want to introduce the text with you real quick. And look, you can start in a safe place. You can start with in Die Hard. Okay? You can bring the movie up. There's no harm in that. But when I say to you the conversation between all these texts, I'm talking about, in this student's case, Die Hard, Brehon, Hezekiah, Donahoe. All of them. We're going to take just a second with this. This is more like the play-by-play. It's still very quick, because this is going to govern most of your paper, all this stuff, you know? But it's pretty quick. This, in a sentence or two, we're going to try to start to sum up the general themes in the movie, in the articles. How are they talking to each other? That's what we're looking to do, okay? So, having the movie in mind, because that's how we started, and then having any of what we talked about in these 3 articles in mind, what are some of the themes we're going to highlight? There's a couple I think that should spring to mind, right? One should be really easy because it's what the class is about. Yeah, look at that, yeah. I was like, come on, somebody gotta give me that one. Yeah. Somehow we're talking about masculinity, and we may get a little more specific, but let's go ahead and file that away, okay? What else do we talk about? Because we talk about cowboys, toughness, talk about self-awareness. He's a typical guy, a typical father. He's an everyman. He's not entirely realistic, I kind of argue, but you know. Because there's different kinds of men. That's not the only kind of guy, right? And I would kind of argue that there are fewer guys like that than there are Grubers type of thing, you know? And it comes down to this code of honor somehow. All of that is kind of wrapped up in masculinity, is it not? Like in one way, shape, or form? Somebody try to give us a 1 or 2 sentence summary of Die Hard if you could. How would you sum up that movie?
A father trying to
Okay, yeah.
Father trying to pick the pieces back up in his life. He's stuck in a battle of survival.
That last part was a little flourish for me. Sure. So what have we laid out for ourselves? The father stuff, the family stuff, and some story bits about terrorists and Christmas. So our leaping off point seems to be fatherhood and family. How are we going to talk about masculinity, leaping off of that stuff? What's fatherhood, family got to do with any of this stuff? Do you think? start. Underscore is a synonym for highlight. I use it too much. What are we trying to kind of say these texts help us understand that the movie is like focused on?
Different types of masculinity.
Okay. How so? Like, what do you mean by that?
Or showing us a different vision of what masculine is.
You're saying the movie is doing that. What does that look like, that different vision? If you could define it a little bit. What makes it different?
He's not the bodybuilder.
So it's attainable. Right? Sure, that's an important difference. What else? We need something else. They help to underscore the attainability of McLean's masculinity. I think that is a good way because we're talking about everyman and fathers and what about the fact that he's a cowboy? Like, you may not may not be with me on the unrealistic thing, which is all good. But another piece of evidence I would put in front of you is the John Wayne stuff. Like, again, in some ways anyway, the John Wayne sort of figure, maybe the world would be a better place in some respects if more people were like that, you know? But we know they're not because of why. Who's John Wayne? He's an actor. He's an actor. We know his characters aren't realistic because they're not real people. And they're set like in the Wuzza, you know, like it's when he's in the movies he's in, a big part of the reason they're popular is because they're sort of antiquated ideals and kind of good old days. It's nostalgia, right? People are like, things were simpler then, people were better. And if McLean in the late 80s is hearkening back to that figure, that also kind of supposes similar aspects, right? Again, I think part of the reason we like him so much is because he's not so typical, he's not so standard, he's not so realistic in some important ways. In a lot of ways he is. I say all that to say, the attainability of his masculinity. You could do that, you could be that. But what else? How are we going to get, pardon the pun, how are we going to rope in this cowboy figure? How are we going to talk about this code of ethics, right? Because I think that's linked to the cowboy figure. How are we going to talk about that here?
His ideals.
What about him?
Believes in, the way he thinks.
Okay. What does he believe in? What does he think? You're carrying us today, and I apologize. How would we describe those ideals? Somehow like a John Wayne, right? Like an old school movie cowboy type of guy. Maybe we can actually make that an adjective. not just ideals, it's idealistic, right? That might be a softer term than unrealistic that you're listening at before. But, and the way, I don't like that we say it twice, but that's what rough drafts are for. Here's the best part. We haven't even done the hard thing yet. The hard thing is next. All right. So we've introduced the primary source, but as I told you before, it is and isn't our text here, right? Our text is the conversation. So what do? We get a little bit of summary because you gotta give us a little bit. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Okay. We brought up a couple important details, though, that we're going to use to springboard into the conversation itself. These texts, meaning the ones I'm about to talk about, help to underscore the attainability of his masculinity, okay? It's something we can aspire to. And the idealistic way, which is kind of a nice way to say, not completely realistic way, he carries himself in his pursuit of that masculinity. And then we get into the nuts and bolts of what that stuff means in our roadmap. Now the fun part. We have got to try in a sentence or two. Believe it or not, a thesis can be 2 sentences. I'll even give you 3 for this one. We got to try to come up with a thesis here. We got to sum up all of this in like 2 or 3 sentences. Now, on the prompt, we do give you a bit of a template. It's like, I've seen it so many times I can probably do it. While there seems to be consensus about X, meaning an idea, there's general, disagreement about Y and Z, meaning 2 other ideas. So when it comes to this roadmap, or if you want, the board as well can help you a little bit if you see anything else up here. Let's start with where these texts agree, generally. They're never going to agree 100% of the time. But I can think of one or two ideas on the top of my head where like pretty much anybody who's ever seen the movie agrees with this idea about Die Hard. Even the first day I brought it up to you, none of you were like, I don't really buy that. You're all like, yeah, I see it. That's pretty good. I agree. Brehan talks about realism. Ezekiel talks about physicality. Donahoe talks about how humble he is.
He's just a good guy.
He's just a guy.
Yeah.
He's just, good, yes, he's a hero, but more fundamental than that. Pretty much everybody you read who's written about this movie, in some way, shape, or form, is going to address the fact that John McClane is much more normal than other action heroes. That everyman term, right? They all agree. They find different ways to talk about it. They find different ways to say it, different aspects to highlight. But all of them, generally, were like, yeah, he's an everyman. Yeah. We agree. Okay. There may be something else they agree about, but I'm guaranteeing they agree about that. We can define that a little bit, and I guess I'll leave us room to do so. But what might they not agree about? Can we find anything? Again, either up there or if it helps you, up here. And again, for those watching the video who can't see the board, these are the notes we took earlier, which I assume you all wrote down because we all take notes. That's a joke for me. Anyway. What might they disagree about? Or another way to think of that, because you don't always necessarily have straight up disagreement, is just like different concerns. Like they talk about the movie in a different way. Do you know what I mean? Like, does Brehan focus on anything that Ezekiel really kind of doesn't? Or Donahoe doesn't think is important, right? She thinks this other thing is important. Do you see anything like that? Told you this would be the hard part about it. While you guys are chewing on that, let's go ahead and define this a little bit, and I'm going to give you some time to ruminate. If we say, and you guys didn't protest, so I assume you agree, authors agree that John McClane operates as a prototypical everyman figure. How so? In what ways do these authors talk about McClane as an everyman? They say he's an everyman because of what?
Body shape is normalness.
Kind of always comes down to physicality, which says?
His normalness.
His normalness. Well, in what way? Are you sure? But in what way?
We embodied the common idea of being a man of the household.
What do you mean by that? I mean, I'm with you, but like, define that just a little bit more.
He presents himself as someone who's someone who wants to be in control of his relationship and be a
Okay.
model for his family.
So like his, as well as his old school, domineering, something like that. The way we talked about it in class is like his 1950s sort of mentality, right? That Holly does not agree with. And that's kind of the, right, they fight about that at the beginning. And what's important though, especially since you brought it up, and I think it's fair to bring it up, is that seems to change a lot for him by the end of the film. So we have to think about that a little bit. But yeah, sure, he's an everyman in those ways. Not just physically, but mentally too, for sure. Okay. Donahoe. I like her here for this, like, we'll call it the disagreement section, even though it isn't technically disagreeing. Because Brehan and Ezekiel connect a lot. They talk about a lot of similar things, right? And there's connections between Donahoe and the others. I'm not saying there's not, but Donahoe is very specifically talking about something the other two are not. Really two things, but they're connected. What's the thing Donahoe was all about that Brehan and Ezekiel are not?
Cowboys for the ball.
Yeah, for sure. Now, if you got these two guys in a room and brought those ideas to their attention, I'm sure they'd have something to say about it. But we don't have that, right? We just have the articles that they gave us. Let's do one more. We're trying to build this thing. We got 2 sentences. We can have at least 3. Probably at the most 3. What's some other area that, again, because the way I phrased it there, I'm not saying they disagree. I'm just saying Donahoe specifically is like, we really need to think about this guy as a cowboy, right? It's a very particular angle that the other 2 articles don't take. And Code of Honor is kind of folded into that cowboy figure, right? Anything else?
Humbleness.
Maybe. I kind of wonder if that gets folded into the cowboy stuff. That's like part of his code, which is part of being a cowboy, you know. Like when you say cowboy, especially capital, like I did, I think that more or less sums up what makes Donahoe different. Like everything she says is a part of that. So we might have to go to one of the other 2 for this last part. Something else that the other articles just, you can't say they straight up ignore, like, how to put this to you. It has to be something you could address in a paragraph. So the other articles have to touch on it in some way. So here's what I mean. The other articles, in a way, absolutely talk about John McClane as a kind of cowboy, right? In the like as an everyman and what makes him an everyman, like, but they don't specifically talk about him as a cowboy. That is hyper specific to Donahoe's argument. So she differs there. Do you see any other ways in Brehan or Acequia that differs, and maybe in terms of detail or how they're posing something from the other articles?
Probably go survival.
Maybe. Why do you say that?
Cowboys code of honor and
Isn't it strictly? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
and being self-aware doesn't really tie into survival. He's fighting for his life.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, we can try it out. All right. Which is largely absent from the other texts. Survival as opposed to what? He's trying to survive rather than what? I mean, win, but that's not. Is that fair? I don't know. We're drafting. All right. His notion of survival as opposed to dominance.
Champion.
Well, if we use it like that as a verb, we'd have to modify it. We can fix that later. Don't worry about it. Where were we? Oh, survival as opposed to dominance ties into the other texts. Okay, so what have we done here? This is our thesis. Again, I'll say it hopefully for the last time today. This is a rough draft. This is a rough draft. And I say that because this is crazy messy. We start out pretty well, in general, and this is usually the easy part, comparatively. Authors agree John McClane is prototypical everyman, and we talked a little bit about what they talk about, right? Physical appearance, his mentality, and there's different ways to talk about his mentality, but we chose one. Okay. Cool. Period. You could either put a period here, or, because I don't think I have one, you could give us a however. That's up to you. I feel like that sentence is long enough. Next sentence or two, you talk about differences in the conversation. Sometimes these will be disagreements. For instance, no one has brought it to my attention yet, but there is a lot of debate online, too much debate, I would say. Anyway, about whether or not it's a Christmas movie. It is, by the way. But if you say that online, you will upset somebody. People have real feelings about this question. It's a debate. It is a Christmas movie. But if you did, for instance, find an article or two that somehow touched on that debate, you'd have a ready-made disagreement. The important thing, the reason, by the way, it is a Christmas movie, hopefully, is what those things would disagree about. I brought this up before, but a lot of people point out, well, it's just set at Christmas. That doesn't make it a Christmas movie. Exactly. That's not what makes it a Christmas movie. So that's not part of the argument. The reason it's a Christmas movie is because, like every other Christmas movie, it starts with a fractured family. What is this movie about? It's not about explosions. It's about reconstituting the family. The father, have you guys ever seen It's a Wonderful Life? Really good movie. Really underrated these days, from like the 40s maybe? It's an old movie. The guy in there, spoilers, the father fails financially. He's going to kill himself at the beginning of the movie. This is a Christmas movie. Gets stopped by a ghost who shows him what will happen if he does this. And the whole town falls apart. Obviously, his family falls apart. And through this, he realizes how important he is to people, how important they are to him. That's the message of the movie. That's what a Christmas movie does. That's what this movie does. It's about family. That would be a part of that debate if you found articles that covered that. Of course, we don't have that here, but you might, in your research. The point is, we didn't have strict disagreement for our text. That's okay too. We found almost like very specific silos into discussions in these articles, okay? They're all in the same field, but every article has like a little niche where like they dig into this giant thing, and that's all about like that's all that article is interested in a big way. Do you know what I mean? Donahoe, absolutely Cowboys. Brehan doesn't concentrate on it like she does with Cowboys, but he is really into that question of like survival as opposed to dominance. He goes on about it for a little while. That's our thesis. The reason you know it's a thesis, it's more specific than this, where we sum up the conversation. You're doing the same thing here. It's much more specific, okay? But it's not so specific that you need more sentences. That's what your roadmap is for, okay? So what does this mean if we go in order? You start with your primary text, real quick summary, and then more importantly, you summarize the conversation. Very vague. Masculinity, it's attainable, he pursues it. It's very vague, too vague for a thesis, but it's where we start. Then you dive into what these things actually mean in the texts. And we did that for a minute. Look at all that. For a minute we did that. And then, even though it will probably hurt, I only really talked to you and a little bit to you, but I saw everybody in here when I kept asking questions about the thesis, all of you were like, ugh, stop it. I know it's not fun, but it looks like this. Questions about any of that? Yes, sir.
Does this thesis need to be a however thesis?
No.
State one thing, however.
Doesn't have to be. I mean, we do have a spot for it, again, because we have like general agreement, however, other sort of, like you could, we basically do that here without a however. But you don't have to. No, you don't have to.
So you don't have to contradict in the thesis.
You don't have to. I mean, it all depends on the sources you find and how you talk about them too. So like, for ours, they generally agree, right? They do. But they don't agree everywhere. They don't all concentrate on the same thing. And to be fair to those sources, I wanted to illustrate that. So it really depends on what you find. Does that make, like, most of what you guys find, again, will not straight up disagree. So even a however might be too strong. But there's, with most of you, a place for, but this author talks about it in this very specific way, which kind of sets them apart. Or these two authors really think this is a Christmas movie and this guy doesn't really talk about it, but the way he talks about the movie seems to indicate he doesn't think it's really about family, or he does, you know what I'm saying? Like does that answer your question in a really convoluted way?
I was wondering why couldn't we get what they do agree on and make a single sentence, maybe 2 sentences thesis on that, rather than what they're contradicting?
Well, because you want to present the whole conversation between the texts. So like, I'm trying to think of a non-confusing way to say this. What I don't want you to do is like cherry pick information. Are you familiar with this term? Okay. And what I mean by it in this way is I wouldn't want you to only pick places where these texts straight up agree. You're going to find a lot of that, hopefully, because they're writing about the same movie and what have you. But as we showed on the board over here, for all the places they agree, there's other places that if they don't, again, strictly disagree, at the very least, they sort of privilege other things, like they value certain aspects of the movie as opposed to others, right? And to fully sort of faithfully represent the conversation, you would have to talk about that stuff. Does that make sense? Like, I mean, another way to do this, for instance, could be, we could say this about Donahoe with the cowboy stuff, and then potentially, maybe, all of this is subject to change, by the way, once we write the paper, but instead of the thing about survival, we could talk about Brehan pointing out that this is one of the first big action movies, to sort of specifically not be about Vietnam, you know? Because it's kind of weird, it comes near the end of his article, but Donahoe and Ezekiel don't talk about that at all, to my memory. So it weirdly kind of very much sets Brehan apart to point that out. It's not a disagreement, it's just a really good observation from Brehan, but also potentially kind of weird that none of the other articles bring it up, you know? Like, and you could say that here, basically. Like, all you're trying to give in this paper is an accurate snapshot of the conversation between these texts. Okay? Your first paper and your third paper, that's you making arguments about a text. The other way I talk about this paper, it's kind of a glorified book report, if that makes more sense. Does that answer your question at all? Okay. I do my best because I don't want to confuse anyone, so I don't want to say the wrong thing. But that's basically how this paper works. I knew it was. Damn it. All right. Well, that took longer than I wanted, but I do think it was important. I'll open the floor real quick. No other questions for me about the paper, about what we got going on. While I'm thinking about it, Kendrick, you were late, as you well know. We had some business stuff at the top of class, so if you don't do anything else, I would watch part 1 from today, probably the first 10 minutes. Okay. Like, we're not meeting next Monday, stuff like that. You want to watch that. But, okay. What else? Let's see. Homework. Rough draft is due next time. I understand you have a lot to do. I was going to have you draft, but we don't have time for that. Apologies. That's due on Turnitin. You have to do that to do the peer review, which we will also do in class next time. Mostly in class, I'm going to give you time to work. So if you think you need anything to do that, for instance, like you have a laptop, I don't know if anybody wants to bring theirs, or If you're behind on research at that point, that'd be a good place to get it done. Anything that's going to help you work on this paper on Wednesday, I would bring it. Okay? Because we're going to devote a lot of class time to that. Yes, sir.
If we have our rough draft, couldn't we assume that the research is done?
Not always.
Maybe the research you have isn't fully developed or uses.
Or you just, you don't have all the sources. Sometimes you guys make up shit too. You're more optimistic than I am. Which is not a bad thing, but I've been disappointed many times by students. That's a really dark way to end class. I guess that's how we'll do it. But again, just bring whatever you need to work. We'll work a little bit before I have you draft. And even in a perfect world, whatever you have done in terms of your rough draft won't be perfect, right? But yeah, that's what we're going to do Wednesday. All right, I'll see you guys then. Thank you.